Thank you, Rod. Okay, I have just started the recording and I will share my screen. Could you please let me know as soon as you see the presentation?
We see it. Thank
Okay,
you,
great. Thank you. So thank you all for being here. As Rod mentioned, this work is undertaken by the Actionary 2.7 of the Global Partnership. And we are here to share our findings and to hear your perspective, your feedback, in order to finalize this report that will be launched in September. This is still a work in progress title, but for now we agreed for this title, which is a Space for Change, Partner Perspectives on an Effective Multilateral System. So I will quickly go over why we did this work and how we did it. So first of all, why we wanted to hear partner perspectives on effective donorship? And the answer is that we wanted to contribute to this very important global discourse on how partner can effectively support the multilateral system and what an effective multilateral system should look like, right? So starting from our literature review, which Rod mentioned, and that I will also share later in this presentation, we arrived at the conclusion that the system is effective, that donors are committed to effective donorship, and this is also true in light of the funding compact that has been agreed between UNSDG and member states. But the effectiveness of the system strictly depends on how partners support it, right? And so from here, the need to frame this concept of effective donorship through the lens of the 4 principles that you can see here: focus on results, transparency and accountability, inclusive partnerships, and country ownership. So how we started, how we did this work? We started by defining the concept of effective donorship, starting from a literature review. And then we explored partner perspective through a series of interviews. And in doing so, we focused on two broad concepts, on two broad issues, which are, first of all, why and how donors execute effective donorship. So we investigated your policies, your mechanisms, your structures, etc. And the second main focus was on the partner perspective on the added value of working with the multilateral system, right? So in other words, what draws donors to work with a multilateral system, and if this can be helpful, is this can effectively help partners to better align with effectiveness principles. So here you can see a table that shows the numbers of partners and the types of partners we're spoken to. 7 bilateral donors, UN partners, multilateral partners, 5 among NGOs and civil societies. We had 2 partner countries, and we are still having interviews, and we will probably have a couple of partner countries more on board. Here in this other chart on the right, you can see the total amount of ODA that comes from the bilateral donors we've spoken to, which is, as you can see, 33% of the total ODA, which is $178.9 billion. And from this figure, 30% goes to the multilateral system. So here I'm going to show you the literature review we started from. I'm not going into it in a very detailed way. It would take too much. But this is just to show you that we started from 3 main reports, which are the Multilateral Development Finance, the Financing the UN Development System from the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation, and the Funding Analysis from the QCPR. So these are the 3 main reports that deal with this concept of effective donorship, right? Then we also analyzed secondary literature review pieces. For example, the MOPA, the OECD DAC peer reviews, and the GPDC monitoring reports, which provided us with 3 different perspectives on performance, respectively, of multilateral partners, donors, and partner countries. And then other pieces about different perspective on principle-led uses of ODA, such as the quota and principle aid index. So starting from this literature review, we understood that there were some other gaps we wanted to try and fill. which are, first of all, try to link the partner commitments to the 4 effectiveness principle. Second, investigating potential trade-offs among these 4 principles. And third, the added value of the UN system in supporting partners and donors to better align with the principles. So these are the 3 main gaps we were trying to fill. And now I will leave the floor to Graham, that will share our main findings.
Yes, thank you, Laura, and good morning, good afternoon to colleagues. I'm going to take us through a quick race through some of the findings so far, and some of the key points which were taken from it. So next slide, please, Laura. So first of all, as we've said, the multilateral system has remained a stable source of development finance over time, despite all the challenges and issues that we're all seeing. And the multilateral flows have actually increased both in volume and as a proportion of ODA over that period. So I think we can say that confidence in the effectiveness of the multilateral system does remain high. Next slide, please. I think from our perspective, looking at the effectiveness principles, information from the QCPR report, which looked at the reasons for why donors channeled money through multilaterals, it was useful to note that the strength of country presence, national implementation, issues around SDG alignment and transparency all featured very highly in the stated reasons for choices. These, from our perspective, map very well to the effectiveness principles, particularly those related to national ownership, focus on resource, and mutual accountability. Next slide, please. I think an example of, this is taken from Global Partnership's own monitoring, that does suggest as well that against several measures, the UN SDG agencies in this particular case are performing well against several measures. For example, this one is based on the use of country results frameworks, which shows that the agencies are comparing they're comparing well compared with all development partners. Next slide, please. Other areas there's still room for ongoing improvement. This graph on predictability highlights that even though there has been improvement, there's still ways to go. Important to note, though, of course we'll come back to it, performance is arguably only as good as the system allows it to be, and predictability of incoming flows does remain a major challenge for many agencies. Next slide, please. So just quickly a summary of evidence, and just to raise a couple of points. So evidence across a number of reports, key reports that we've mentioned and some which we haven't, suggests that whilst reforms are still ongoing and there is room for improvement, that the multilateral system is an effective way of channeling resources to areas most in need, and also importantly, it's an important means of convening and coordinating collective action. But the system is shaped by the way it's supported, and this can be seen both in the positive attributes that we can point to, but also some of the challenges that it faces. Next slide, please. I'm going to go through now a number of the key issues that came out of our consultations with partners and colleagues, and we've grouped some of these according to the effectiveness principles themselves, just as one way of looking at issues. So just a bit of feedback around some of the perceptions around national ownership. National ownership was recognised by most people, but I don't think anybody didn't mention this, as an incredibly important principle across the different types of stakeholders that we spoke to. What I think was interesting is perhaps it's sometimes easy to think that funding through multilateral channels might dilute rather than reinforce national ownership. But discussions we had revealed that the picture is much more complex, and in some circumstances, multilateral support enabled support to be provided in circumstances where it would otherwise be considered too risky to continue by bilaterals, for example on fiduciary or political risk grounds. And the support through multilateral channels actually made it possible to continue to work on issues around national ownership whilst kind of very nascent and fragile reform and capacity building processes continued. The other key issue that came out of discussions around national ownership was perhaps that there's still opportunities still being missed by both multilaterals and others to continue to work to expand the scope and the depth of national ownership. And perhaps particularly to flag, some respondents noted the importance of work with, with other parts of government, for example, including parliaments and also supreme audit institutions, in addition to civil society. And the point was made, it's good to have capacity building programs, for example, for parliaments, but also one needs to then make sure that you're properly engaging them in discussions around national frameworks, including your own plans and resources, so that they're able to exercise the scrutiny that they're supposed to bring. Next slide, please. Just a few issues then on focus on results, and this was perhaps the area where there was very clear recognition, particularly by donors but by others, of the value of multilateral support in terms of its support for normative approaches and standards, human rights-based approaches, pooling of risk and added value, and again this issue around the convening power that multilaterals can bring. And to flag that amongst the reforms that were discussed, the strengthening of the resident coordinator system, of the resident coordinator role and system and its functions has been seen to be critical in this regard, but is also critical moving forward. So it's not time to take the eye off the ball, and it's, there's still issues to take forward, and that will be critical to continued strengthening of approaches. Next slide, please. A few issues on mutual accountability. The funding compact and the QCPR approach, both seen as very important parts of reforms by a lot of stakeholders. But there's a sense, that in some, from some stakeholders that it does remain quite one-sided in some ways, with limited practical comeback or response if and when donors don't deliver on commitments, or on occasion perhaps have to reverse on commitments. There's a sense that many decisions remain crisis and security driven, and in these circumstances it's often perhaps easy to squeeze multilateral aid rather than bilateral, given its potential repercussions in terms of bilateral relations. At the same time, it's recognised that donors of course have their own policy objectives and constraints, and that's noted, but maybe there's space for more use of partnership arrangements as a way of improving predictability, which remains a challenge. The other thing to flag here is that as financial flows have increased, so too have the proliferation of official finance providers, and that's added to complexity. But as we'll see later, that there are other sort of ways of looking at that as well. And then next slide, please. On inclusive partnerships, just two issues to flag here. It was noted by a lot of people that there is increased collaboration between UN SDG agencies and others, and there is reduced competition in the negative side of competition. But this remains quite dependent and driven by funding, it was noted by others. The importance attached to collaboration is good, but without core funding of agencies, in a sense, core funding enables that collaboration, because without it, people are driven to chase other sources of money, including project approaches. And then the other one to mention here is it was felt by quite a few respondents, particularly those from civil society colleagues, that there's still issues related to their space and role in policy dialogue, recognised as equals in terms of the partnership principles, but that in reality the space for them has often shrunk, and that's a challenge and something that continues to need to be worked on. Just moving on, thank you. Next slide. Just a quick overview, quick couple of points on how multilateralism is supported, and just to make the point that respondents said, core and earmarked contributions have both been increasing, but concern that earmarking is more than quadrupled. And I think people will have read in various reports, in one report named that the concern about multilateralism being bilateralized and multilateralism a la carte becoming an issue. And again, it makes the point about sufficient core resources being extremely important. On the other side, significant proportion of earmarking is allocated in a manner which can be described as relatively soft, and that point was made. And some stakeholders pointed out that when they're making funding choices, if they're not able to make core support, they do earmark as softly as they can, but that doesn't necessarily get captured in the funding compact indicators. Just the next slide, please. Aware of time. Just to quickly mention, I think people have seen this graph in various forms. Development and humanitarian balances, particularly over the last 2 or 3 years, I think humanitarian assistance or expenditure has surpassed that for development, and it looks set to continue, to be honest, especially in the light of climate change. When we had discussions, some people felt this reflected, a focus by donors on short-term responses and possibly sometimes at the expense of international development. It perhaps can also be argued, though, that rather than being about a discussion about proportions, we perhaps need to see this as highlighting the need for advocacy around additionality, both for humanitarian response and additional resources for development, and also the promotion of greater work across the HDP, the nexus, basically, in what are going to be challenging and difficult times ahead, including, focus on prevention. Also to note that in the humanitarian sector, UN SDG agencies have become very adept at developing and obtaining donor resourcing for instruments such as the SURF, and also work being done around anticipatory action is perhaps of interest when we're moving forward. Next slide, please. Just finally, we did ask some questions, and we'll be putting this more in the report, around the comparative advantages of the UN SDGs and the international finance institutions. We've talked a lot about the SDG comparative advantages. Just to flag on the IFI side, some of the clear advantages mentioned were around the role of shareholder boards and the influence that membership brought, the pooling of risk, again, particularly fiduciary risk and financial controls, but also the leverage of resources that the IFIs were able to bring, including additional resources for development around private capital markets and others, and that was a really clear comparative advantage and important role. Thank you, and I'll hand over to Rod. Thanks.
Hi, colleagues. Thanks for that, Graham. So we've been going on a little while. There's, again, a lot to share with you. I'm going to commit to try and wrap this up in 5 minutes here. I saw we had some discussion in the chat, I think. We'll check on that too. If that was our chat. Oh, no, that was another one, Laura. Okay, I will spare your blushes. Okay, so we'll try and finish in 5 minutes, colleagues. I'm just going to run through some provisional conclusions and introduce some of these concepts. This is the elements that, we still need to unpack. We'd love to hear from you, your thoughts on this. So let me get straight through it. So we've heard from Laura why we set out to do this, right? There is this discussion around multilateralism. We see the principles as just an essential way of working, of being inclusive, of making sure there's ownership, of making sure the results are sustainable. And she talked through our methodology, and Graham has given us some findings from existing literature, excellent existing literature, but also our own discussions with partners and what that's told us so far. So I think a lead-off idea here is, that there are many kind of niche and nuanced discussions around ownership. It's multifaceted, right? We heard there from Graham, does ownership mean working with the executive government? Does it mean working with elements of society? Does it mean working more closely with accountability mechanisms in country, whether that's parliamentarians or auditors, right? So there are these issues. There are issues around, for instance, how the way the system is funded impacts its ability to be effective in line with the principles. But one sort of meta finding we had is that what makes the system effective for partners, and especially those who support it, is that the system and multilateral institutions, they are a policy space. They are a space for doing things we wouldn't otherwise be able to do. So this calls to mind for me Thomas Weiss's idea. There's a academic who works a lot on the UN, the idea of 3 UNs, right? There is a forum, there is a secretariat, if you will, a standing body of people who try to give life and meaning to the decisions of that forum. And then there is the UN as a repository of norms. And again, each of these speaks to the multilateral system as a policy space. It's not just an implementing mechanism, or it's not just a meeting venue. It's really a policy space end to end. And 2 further features we found: it's a space for managing what can often be competing objectives, and often objectives that we don't resolve, but we navigate. And the system gives us the space to navigate these issues over the long term. So in this instance, when we spoke with partners, 3 key themes emerged. It emerged in virtually all interviews, and each of these 3 ideas came up in every interview with every development partner, donor that we spoke to. One is country ownership and access. There was an acute sensitivity to, you want to do the programming, you need some kind of connection at the country level. There was a very frank understanding of partners' own objectives and their own policy agenda, and there was an understanding that of international norms, and often the need to work within these, in parallel to them, leverage them, from human rights to gender programming. And then by contrast, some things we heard less of, for instance, leveraging. We thought we'd hear a lot about that, but that was more with IFIs. That was a big dynamic, but with the system more broadly, not so much. So this idea of the system as a policy space, again, this is not terribly new. That what makes the system so effective for partners is it creates this space and new options. Like I said, Thomas Weiss pushes on this idea. The ODI also, in their work, just to take one example, they have the Principal Aid Index. And this idea of a space for balancing competing objectives, is really front and center. They have the Principal Aid Index. It has 3 main components. I think it's development gaps, public spiritedness, and global cooperation. And they actually illustrate this idea of there being a space for partners to balance their own interests and broader values and norms. So what we want to do is we think, if you put this lens on the multilateral system more specifically, we can actually add to it based on the feedback we've got. And we get the concept of a trilemma, right? So if in a dilemma, one course of action precludes another, it means you can't do it. In a trilemma, you have a set of competing objectives, and pursuing any 2 means that the third becomes harder, right? And we just want to go into this as a way of exploring the kind of the added value of the system as a policy space. So let me give you an example for the trilemma, how we might illustrate it. We can think of a recent policy where there's been a very clear foreign policy objective, and there's even been very high level of country ownership. So for this one, I might think, for instance, of the recent UK asylum policy of essentially flying asylum seekers directly to Rwanda, right? Rwanda is bought into this as a policy. For the UK, they're meeting their objectives, but based on the decision of the European Court of Human Rights, this really violated international norms, and the flights were stopped. Now let's look at a different side of this triangle. We could take something that is aligned with foreign policy objectives, but also international norms. I would think of COVAX, right? This was the facility for distributing COVID vaccines. The premise of COVAX was that the patent for it not be shared with countries, right? That's why we needed this distribution mechanism. So you have high alignment with international norms. Everyone should have access to the vaccine. Countries saying they're invested in this as an outcome, but actually it was designed as a system with less access to ownership. Maybe with a bigger role for the system, we could have negotiated something that did permit a bit more ownership, or arguably they tried to do that through involvement of the WHO. So now how does the system, so our argument here is that the system, in a way, it creates the space whereby you can navigate between these 3 different competing objectives. And I'll give you an example. We spoke to one donor partner, a couple of partners we spoke to at country level. This one happened to be in Kinshasa, and they described to us, look, on some programming, we work directly with the government. And for that area of programming, we find that effective. But in another area of programming, we found working directly with the government had certain risks. So we worked with a UN agency and we funded their country program document directly. Right, so they found a way to use the system, and the system gave them a space to continue to invest in a form of country ownership, right? But that they wouldn't have had without the system. And the way it works essentially is that by collectivizing action and to an extent externalizing action, you're de-risking. That's a big part of the sort of the added value. That de-risking element then makes the system an effective space for partners for different types of policy work and new policy work. So that's in terms of our expectations and perceptions and some of the things we found. Now going on to how partners support it, we thought the funding compact would be a major vehicle for this analysis, right? We return to this theme. The system is shaped by how it's supported by partners. Here we have an explicit tool that sets funding obligations against reporting commitments. And of course, it's important. And the measures there will help the system be more effective in terms of the principles. For instance, more core resources allow, to focus on results more and countries' own priorities, and especially as we saw during COVID, respond to sudden onset crisis. But, and there is a good aware of the compact, but we also saw there's limited evidence for how it's driving behavior so far. And it quickly gets very technical, and some of those we will highlight in the paper. We can and should recognize softer forms of earmarking. That's important. It does help the system, right? But there are broader issues. And so moving on, and Graham touched on these issues in our discussion, for all the awareness of the compact, there was also a very keen sense of and really thoughtful reflections on other channels. And the two main ones that came up were humanitarian financing, which is, as a share of operational activities for development by the UN is now larger than development for the first time, I think ever, or if not in a long time, and then financing oriented, the international financial institutions. Now, these two channels, we were essentially hearing for many donors and partners, it was just easier to drive resources through these, right? And there are some obvious issues and advantages, right? The political arguments for humanitarian funding, the sheer need, the narrative of proliferating crises, and the way you can push policy with that, right? If we think about financial institutions, they're typically linked to finance ministries or central banks, essentially very powerful organs in state, even within development partners. And we heard repeatedly, when you give the money to, a financial institution, you're buying into a shareholding as well as the program outcomes, right? So there are some clear advantages there. They're just distinct from the development system and other parts of the multilateral system. But for each channel, there are also special mechanisms, tools, and political arguments that we think can at least be explored and potentially adopted and or adapted so that we can begin to move towards a slightly different approach to funding for the development system and the grant-based, our grant-based development interventions. And again, we're still unpacking this. We want to get to more concrete recommendations. But yeah, and hopefully our discussion here with you will help us get there. So I rambled on, colleagues. I'm sorry, I blew past the 5 minutes I promised, but we'll stop there. And we'd love to hear any questions or thoughts you have for us. Hi, Larissa, please go ahead. Thank you for breaking the ice. That's kind.
Thank you very much. My name is Larissa. I'm here on behalf of the German Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, and you were in contact with my colleague Miriam Philippe before for an interview. Thank you very much for these insightful presentations, and I hope we'll have a chance to look at them again because it's a really rich presentation. Afterwards, I have it's easy to break the ice because I just have a question to understand better whether this humanitarian, I tend to say versus development funding is going to be part of the report that you're writing, and whether you are going to argue in this form of a trade-off with limited resources being channeled to humanitarian or to development funding, or whether you are going to just develop the insights on the how would you say that, advantages and disadvantages that you heard from donors, partner countries, etc., in these two different areas, so to say, of funding. I hope I made myself clear. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Larissa, that's a great question. I will speak. I probably hand it over to Graham to come back. So just to put it bluntly, this is a live discussion between us. I was getting told off just yesterday by Graham for making it too much of a dichotomy, right? So this is absolutely a live discussion between us. Because you're from Germany, I hope it's okay that I use Germany as an example, because otherwise we're anonymizing the results. We just say so-and-so from this, from the development partner group said. But as you're from Germany, we were talking with BMZ. It was a wonderful discussion, and you guys have very strict legal frameworks essentially that help ensure that humanitarian spending is additional, and that's a great tool. And we heard the same from another partner, also from your region. They had a separate credit framework, for instance, right? And this to me sounded wonderful, because additionality is a big issue here. And if you have legal frameworks and financial tools that make sure of that additionality, that's great. But then the counterpoise is, how do you do work in the nexus, right? And that becomes actually quite complicated. And there is a space between development and humanitarian and crisis response, and the connection, we've been talking about it for years and years and years. I'm not a fan of the term nexus. I feel like the discourse displaces actual, the work that should be happening there. But anyway, does frameworks to ensure additionality, does it come at the expense of that kind of more integrated programming? So this is absolutely a live discussion for us. We don't, and to answer your question directly as possible, I think, and Graham can come in and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think we want to stop at just describing the pros and cons. I do think we want some thoughtful, if not prescriptions, what are the tools your peers and partners are using to achieve X, and then you can read it and say, okay, does this work for us? Does this fit into our framework? But it's a great question, and it's a live one for us. I don't know if you have anything to add, Graham or Laura.
Not really. I mean, not much, but just to say that I think, the issue for us, a little bit what we heard from people was, it might be easy for it to become a discussion around, well, do you put money into humanitarian or do you put money into development? And whereas the kind of the issues are, how do we have sufficient resources to make the responses we need, and what can we do in the policy space to make those arguments? And also the issues around making sure that there's funding across the nexus are very important. And I know that, if I'm not mistaken, I know Germany, you do have specific frameworks for that as well. But it was just recognizing that this is likely to be an ongoing challenge, and also one that's, regrettably likely to get worse when we look at, the impacts of climate change, and also climate finance now also, being part of that space as well. So it was, that I think we'll have that discussion more in the report.
If that's okay, Larissa, if you want to come back, feel free. Otherwise, I'll move on to Kim, who I think has a question.
Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, Kim. Did you want to come in?
Yes, thank you. First of all, I missed the earlier consultation, and I would just underscore what I think people have already said, that the multilaterals can be really valuable in establishing and holding up norms and standards, whether it's development effectiveness principles or rule of law or freedom of association, and many important standards. So I just underscore that. The trilemma is really interesting and I think helpful. If I can complicate it a little bit, did you give any thought to local norms, values, standards in the framework, and what the implications might be? I mean, there are many situations where it's hard to imagine country ownership without respect for local standards and norms, which may be more or less aligned with international norms, and in some cases may be problematic in our view from a development standpoint. So how might they factor in?
So this is a great question, and it's good enough. I might see if Graham wants to have a pop at it.
I think it is a great question. I think the answer is we probably didn't think about it in great detail. I mean, certainly when we had discussions, kind of issues around the localization agenda came up, but I think the narrative so far that we've got, and like we said, we do still have a few interviews to go, were concerns in terms of local agency, if you like, not necessarily at government level, but civil society, about reducing space for them. That they felt, well, all these standards were great, some of the principles that have been put forward, but that actually some of them are really struggling to maintain space, and perhaps that's in some cases reduced. And I mean, I think one person said that they were involved in a lot of space when the focus was on poverty reduction, but when a particular place met middle income status, people felt it was okay to shrink their space again because they weren't needed in the same way. So I think it's a very interesting point, maybe one we'll think about more. But I think the debate is around some of the issues around the kind of localization and how you're making sure that you're consulting with a range of partners at a national level.
So Kim, I think it's a really great question. It's a really valid point that's live whenever we talk about norms. What are considered international standards of gender equity, we know don't apply across the world, right? And I do think this interacts with this issue of ownership. I guess one take on it might be, and just to be clear here, I think it's a great point, and it's one I think we'll incorporate in the write-up. This is the great thing about this, is that we get these challenging questions, and at least we can pretend like we thought of it ourselves when we write the report up, even if we don't answer it. But one dimension might be is thinking of those very distinct local norms in terms of a kind of local ownership. And then we say, okay, how does this play out in terms of the effectiveness of the system and the way it helps partners achieve their goals? I'm sat in UNDP, like I think to the country office, right? Ideally, if you have a partner that says in Kinshasa, I'm not confident enough to work directly with the government on this particular area of programming, but I'll work on the CPD they've agreed, the country program document, right? The country office almost becomes like a brokering space, right? Because the country office is mostly composed of staff from the country. They will share those local norms and values, at least in part, and they bring them to bear to some extent in the programming, in the way it's done. And there you get some of that buy-in, if you like, within the space of the multilateral, within the country office. It's a bit of a fudge, what I'm saying, but I just think it's maybe a different way of thinking about it, that if we, these distinct local norms that might even clash with international ones, how can we think about them if we think of it under that idea of country ownership more broadly, right? Not just an agreement with the executive, but actually vaguely aligned with local norms and customs and whatnot. Maybe that's where the system comes in playing that kind of brokering role, almost within the country office, as it were. That might not make sense, and forgive me if it doesn't, but that's just one take I had on that, colleagues. Anything else, colleagues? Did you want to come back, Larissa, or is this a hand from before? I think from before. So Alessandro, please go ahead.
Good morning, good afternoon. I don't have any question, only an observation in terms of my thought process right now in reaction to this very useful information. A lot of it is way beyond me because I don't really deal with these questions of donorship directly. But I do have relations with the UN, one of the largest multilateral, I imagine. And thinking of national ownership, because Rod, you mentioned in presenting the slide you know, the extent to which Parliament is part of that. Obviously, for us, it is a key actor in ensuring national ownership of development decisions and with respect to support to the country, the campaign. Clearly, what this discussion has illuminated for me definitively is the difference between the strong mandate the multilaterals like the UN have gotten from the very top, the General Assembly in this case, to work at the country level with the national parliament. And therefore, we are seeing over many years now, it took a long time, but we are seeing this paying dividends with more regular relations between the national parliament and the UN country team, the UNDP representative, the resident coordinator. So there's much more opportunity for the UN as a multilateral to actually engage the parliament on what the UN is doing there and the support it's giving to the government, the country program, and etc. Whereas a similar mandate, to my knowledge, has never really been very explicit or a matter of discussion within the bilateral community. Meaning, we don't know really under what pressure is the the Swiss Development Agency or the German Development Agency or the US or the UK, what have you, to actually directly engage with the parliament of the countries where they're lending support. So my takeaway from this is I'm going to do some homework here and try to figure out exactly what mandate is there within the bilateral agency community from the countries, from the donor country, and a mandate that may have to come directly from the parliament of the donor country that would say by law, whenever they sign off on the support that the country will give, that has to be some kind of a direct reporting to the parliament of the recipient countries, which will be a mimicking of what happens already in some way from the GA to the UN, UNDP, etc., vis-a-vis the recipient countries where they operate. So I'm only sharing my thought process here. I'm not asking any question, but just say it's clear to me that there is a strong differential here, and so there's some homework potentially for us like you to follow up. Thank you. Very useful.
Yeah, Alessandra, that's a great thought. So my first thing listening to you is, and I'm pretty sure this is on our list of, we're still kind of spitballing the recommendations. We're just kind of throwing things at a wall and we'll categorize them later. Capturing this this example you gave us, it was already on our to-do list, but this example where you worked really hard towards this resolution as an IPU, and then that kind of authorization is bearing fruit over time about how and when to work with the parliaments. That we want to absolutely build on. Can we do that with other partner types? Because one of the gaps that, we focus less on for this presentation, but inclusive partnerships is arguably the bigger gap here for the multilateral system. By design, it almost is an inclusive partnership, but in terms of trying to bring in different types of actors at country level, it's very variable. So having concrete recommendations for that, like this one, like the work you guys put into the resolution and the way that's bearing fruit, we really should capture that, colleagues, and let's make a note of that. The second part, we hadn't thought about how do essentially DAC country parliaments authorize agreements. But what we had thought is, because every partner mentioned their own objectives, what we thought was, well, what is the accountability for this objective, right? What makes this whole area very complex, this notion of country ownership so complex, we tried to think it through. I think there's a very simple dynamic. We're talking about national development, which is about as big a domestic issue as you could possibly consider, but it's happening through the mechanism of a foreign relationship. And of course, the foreign policy channels, they're not typically very exposed to parliamentary scrutiny or to auditor scrutiny or to civil society review or things like that. So you have this absolutely central domestic policy area, the development of the nation, but operating in a sphere that's usually been the preserve of just the executive on its own, right? And that's why I think what you're raising about how do we get scrutiny on this is so important. Now, when I was discussing with colleagues, and this actually drew on, again, Graham's great experience here, you know, I said, well, how does, for instance, the UK agree what it does in Ethiopia? You know, and I think there was a discussion that the best case example, you actually have an explicit partnership agreement. And actually you just agree in writing, and it's more accessible than not, but this is what we're doing and why. The idea, for instance, that that partnership agreement should be subject to parliamentary scrutiny, not just in the partner country, but also in the development partners country, I think is a really great idea, and it's really interesting. And let's put that forward, colleagues, and see if we can capture, I think, the richness of the idea Alessandro is sharing into something thoughtful. Anything to add, colleagues?
No, I think you captured an important point. Yeah.
I believe we go to Prasad. Is that okay? And forgive me if I mangled the name.
Yeah. Hi, good morning, good afternoon. Many thanks. My name is Santosh. I'm part of the DCD OECD peer review team. And I just received invitation by proxy from colleagues. I'm very happy I joined because it's super interesting. And I was very happy to see you are being more granular than saying only multilateral, because there's so many things that are hidden within, so say, what is multilateral, and a big chunk is funding for the EU, then you have the IFIs and the UN, and I think that's really important for the report to show that there are differences, say, different uses of parts of the multilateral system and reasons for doing so, and some may be the same. So I'm fully supportive of that, because it's important to say multilateral has so many different facets and usages. On a question just out of curiosity, precisely because the multilateral system goes beyond, so to say, financing from OECD DAC members, has there been any reflection on, so to say, the interaction with the non-DAC, the others, the non-traditional donors, the emerging donors that provide sometimes very substantial amounts to both UN agencies, IFIs, and if that is a feature, to say, of the why maybe, or some of the drawbacks of the engagement with the multilateral system. And if you allow just a thought on the parliamentary approval, just from personal experience, sometimes the risk is the really long procedures. So you can agree something, and then it might take 2 years for parliaments to approve something, and you can't go ahead. So it's a risk to consider in terms of recommendation, to say everything needs to be formally approved by a parliamentary process. Many thanks.
So let me let another colleague start on a response here if they have any thoughts. I have 1 or 2 things to share here.
Yeah, thanks, Santosh. I mean, I think, you know, very good points, and nice to see you again. I think the issue about the non-DAC is actually very interesting. I mean, we're kind of aware of it, and I guess when we've been looking at the stats, and you know, it becomes even more apparent, you know, that it's of growing importance. But I mean, I think it's something that maybe we will touch on in the report, and I'll see what Rod says. But it's not something I have to say that we systematically examined in this so far in this analysis. But I agree, that's an important issue. On the parliamentary issue, I see the challenge, and you know, I guess if we can all think of examples where, you know, if there's a very big difference between the Parliament and the executive, then that might become a very complex issue, which people may feel drawn into as well. So I guess I see the complexity whilst kind of recognising the principle, if you see what I mean. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks for that, Graham, and thanks for the thoughts, Santosh. I guess just in response, you know, my first reflection is I think it's a very valid point. You know, and then it sort of blurs into what have become their own thematic areas, you know, maybe triangular cooperation, we could explore that and whatnot. So the short answer is probably, I think it's just been a bit of a blind spot for us. Now, the question is, why has it been? So one, I think we could capture this in the report. It might be a text box, it might be something. If you have thinking and material, absolutely share it. We'd be happy to capture it, you know. And especially if that helps you, for instance, you know, cross-promote other work, because as you can see, we're a fan of what's coming out the DCD. It's been essential to our own work. The second thing is, to some extent, that blind spot is justified. So, you know, we were looking at the recent DAC figures. I think 88% of the UN development system is being paid for by the DAC. Probably more like 15, 20 donors within the DAC, right? 89% of the IDA replenishment is the DAC. So, you know, $7 and $8 is still, you know, this kind of, it still maps onto this kind of north-south DAC, non-DAC thing. So you have a great point, and we'll address it if we can. But again, I think the bulk of what we're saying, we think it's okay to do it the way we've done. Just as a final reflection, you know, I think we're still, unfortunately, we're still in a world where non-DAC resources are like a nice to have or a bonus type thing, right? So, and the environment is just pressure piling up on the DAC, financial, you know, in terms of political arguments, all kinds of things. And one of the sort of background objectives for us was really, you know, we know partners see value in this, which is why they invest, you know, 50, $60 billion a year into the system as a whole, right? And that's not the development system right now, that's the whole UN system. So how do we bring these arguments forward, if you like? How do we put these arguments back in front of the directors general and permanent secretaries and whatnot, so that they can reflect that to their minister? I mean, I was in a meeting with the DAC chair last week, and I think she put it best. She said, you know, some of these guys are starting to say, well, we can't afford this or that. And the point she's trying to make to them is, well, you can't afford not to, you know? These are investments that you make, and that's how we get to this idea of policy space and it being an enabling mechanism for their own objectives. But that also, you know, is useful for crowding people in, for, you know, being a guardian for norms and so on and so forth. So in a way, some of the messaging, it is somewhat tailored to the existing sources of support because it's coming under so much pressure. But again, just to say, I think it's a very valid point, and part of the solution should be bringing in new and other partners. So we'll do our best to capture that, and if you can help us do that, we'd be very grateful. Anything else, colleagues? Any other thoughts? So we have hit an hour. We started a couple minutes late, but if there's anything that anyone would like to share, we'd love to hear from you. And just to say, I'll come back to Alessandro now, but just to say, we will circulate the slides. We've deliberately written our notes into the slides because about 2/3 of our interviewees couldn't come, essentially, right? So we've written the notes into the slides so you can run through them, and we've recorded it. So do feel free to come back to us with more. We'll circulate drafts of the report as we have them, and we want to keep this very much an ongoing dialogue. Over to you, Alessandro.
Just quickly to respond, I think the question of parliamentary approval, quote unquote, that's not really what I was alluding to necessarily. It's clear that it's the government, the executive, that signs the donor agreements, etc. So that we're not interfering with that. But you will be amazed in how many places the awareness the parliaments have of the donor presence in the country comes down to a few dollar amounts in the budget document. There is hardly any relationship with individual donors other than the multilateral, like I said, because they are mandated to have that relationship. So for the parliament to just be briefed by the bilaterals individually on what they're doing there, what have they negotiated, in what way are they contributing to the country, to the national development plan, is an opportunity for the parliament to then ask questions of the government and therefore exercise its prerogative of oversight and accountability. And therefore to go deeper into this whole development cooperation discourse, and otherwise it's very much at the door of the parliament and not inside. So that's what I'm trying to say, because even in the case of the UN doesn't go to the parliament and say, hey, is this okay? Is it okay if we do this, this, and that in your country? No, that's a discussion that first and foremost happens with the government, right? But the parliament benefits from being aware of the discussion, benefit from being in a position to then ask questions of the government, and benefit from being in a position to then ask, well, at the end of the day, what happened? What have we delivered? You know, are the results? What are the results and all that? So it's at that level that I was discussing the opportunity that I think we may be missing, particularly when it comes to the bilaterals as opposed to the multilaterals. So it's not. I don't pretend that I have it all right here, but I'm just pointing to an area that deserves more consideration. That's what I'm trying to say, and more research also. And again, the parallel with the GA telling the UN system, you got to, at the country level, you got to cooperate with the parliaments versus individual countries and their parliaments that have yet to issue similar mandates versus their own donor agencies. That strikes me as an interesting area to explore. That's all.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, Alessandro. And those are useful nuances. And again, some of these issues, non-DAC partners, we probably should have had at least one respondent from there. So that's a good point, Santosh. But also this, does parliamentary scrutiny mean sort of veto power, or does it just mean consultation and awareness and having a live dialogue, and we can capture these in either in the body of the analysis or as text boxes. We take a deep dive into this as an issue. And like I say, I mean, we were delighted to speak to IPU. You also helped connect us to this grouping of supreme auditors. And what was so fascinating to me is it wasn't just generic feedback from, other types of partners who happen to be involved in development. We were really speaking to the heart of country ownership and what it means and why it's such a thorny issue, and where does it begin and where does it end and why does it look different in different country settings and so on. So yeah, capturing basically this little, smaller discussion we've had here, we'd love to reflect that fully in the paper. And I think it speaks very much to the system, how it works with partners, and how it is and isn't effective. And thanks for the note here in the chat, Paco. I'm glad that for the Inter-American Development Bank, this was able to add some value. You definitely added value to our work, and we hope you find the finished product useful. Anything else, colleagues? I know it's on the one hand, everyone is busy. On the other hand, most parts of the world are very hot right now. So you'll deserve a break. So if there isn't much to add, I will bring the meeting to a close, but just see if any final thoughts from colleagues. Alessandro, this is an old hand, correct? Or did you want to come back?
No, sorry, it's an old hand.
Great. Okay, so thank you so much, colleagues. Just in terms of some next steps, we're gonna get back to drafting. We took a little break to prepare for this. It's actually really helped us to clarify our thinking and arguments and maybe see some of the gaps. I think we would hope to share a draft, mid-August. We're looking to a launch mid-September. We'll try and make that as interesting for colleagues as we can. We are in discussion with the UN University, which is useful because actually it's a think tank within UNU that is hosting the Secretary General's high-level panel on effective multilateralism, actually. And we've connected up with them. We're having some discussions. They're looking forward to having this paper as an input into the panel's deliberations. And we're hoping we can bring along a member of the panel, hopefully a co-chair, to the launch meeting, likely on the margins of UNGO, the UNGA, in September. And we hope to see you all there. And if you want to have a more active role in that event, do reach out and let us know. We'd love to have that. And otherwise, thank you for your time and attention, colleagues. We spoke a lot. Hopefully it wasn't too much. We'll circulate slides, the recording, and the paper will be with you soon. And yeah, let's keep the dialogue going. Thank you so much.